Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. Today, my friends, I'm delighted to welcome Bernard Lane to the Storybox. Bernard is a journalist. He also runs the Gender Clinic News, which is freely available for people if they want to go and sign up there. There's also a paid version, I believe. Bernard, is that right?
That's right. There's a paid option.
Yep. So people can go and check out your amazing work over there. Now, instead of me gushing about all the incredible things that you are doing and have done in your life, Bernard, what I normally do now is I shift the introduction onto my guests and I ask my guests, would you be able to take it over and explain to me and to my audience who you are and what you actually do? So, Bernard, please take it away.
Okay. Well, my name is Bernard Lane. I'm an Australian journalist. And for most of my working life, I was working for newspapers. Mostly the Australian newspaper based in Sydney. And I wrote about many different subjects there over the years. And then following a story assignment by my editor, I fell down the rabbit hole of transgender activism and then into gender clinics and the medical interventions with kids who feel this distress in their body, and through a rather complicated set of circumstances, I left the Australian, and by then I had set up my Substack newsletter, Gender Clinic News, and so that's where all of my writing is now at genderclinicnews.com. But I started writing about the gender medicine issue in the middle of about August, September of 2019 at the Australian newspaper, and wrote there on that subject for a few years, finally leaving the Australian mid-2022. So I think it was August last year I wound up at the Australian. And so here I am.
Here you are indeed, and welcome so much to the Storybox podcast today.
Thanks, Jay.
It's a pleasure to have you on. And one of the main reasons as to why I wanted to have you on this show, and upon doing a great deal of research myself and reading some of your articles that you've got up there, I'm very much interested in this, I guess you could call it the gender debate at the moment, or the gender wars, as Kathleen Stock is calling them. And it's a rather interesting kind of war, because I never thought for my 26, almost 27 years on this earth that we'd even be here right now talking about something that should be so basic for anyone to understand. But one of the things that I'm actually interested in, Bernard, is when you first encountered the transgender narrative, what was your initial reaction to it?
Well, I was aware of it, at the fringe of my consciousness, if you like. I was vaguely aware that there was an area where the debate was toxic, but I hadn't really looked at it until my editor in early 2019 asked me to write about the cancellation of Barry Humphries, the Australian comedian. And so, as people may recall, early 2019, Barry Humphries had made some remarks about transgender medicine with children. I think he used the term mutilation. Mm-hmm. And in response, a number of comedians and activists put a lot of pressure on the Melbourne Comedy Festival to change the name of the award for, the leading comedian of the year. They were called the Barrys. And so I must say I thought at the time that Barry Humphries' language was quite provocative. But the reaction to his remarks was so disproportionate. The wish to totally remove reference to someone We call it cancellation, don't we? Or, in other contexts, it's deplatforming. So that sort of total demand for conformity was what struck me early on. Was the way in which trans activists try to shut down debate, and when I say trans activists, most of them are not trans. They're not people who identify as trans. It's a much larger group. You might think of them also as social justice activists, and quite a few very politically active people on the centre left of our political parties. They behave in this way, and of course, they have their counterparts all around the world. Not just in the English-speaking countries either. And, the conduct is very similar. It's, a demand for total conformity in language, in the opinions that can be expressed. And if someone is seen to be sceptical or critical, then all sorts of pressure is brought to bear. Often anonymously and behind the scenes, anonymous complaints to employers, complaints on social media, complaints to the platforms, trying to get people's accounts suspended, trying to get their accounts demonetized, trying to get people to lose their jobs, lose their livelihood. And the striking thing is that usually, I'm not sure if I've ever seen it, but often there is no intermediate stage where the trans activist tries to engage in good faith conversation about what someone else has said. Some people do. Some of the people you could call trans activists do that, but often it seems to me they go straight for the nuclear option. They don't seem to believe in the possibility of reasoning with someone to arrive at a different point of view. And the fact that they go for suppression and censorship and punitive measures suggests that they don't really have good arguments, or they don't really even believe in the possibility of persuasion.
Yeah. I think it's outrageous how they go to try and cancel everybody rather than having a meaningful debate. If you live in a democratic society, you should be able to have a healthy debate. Share ideas, share viewpoints respectfully, and go back and forth. But for whatever reason, these activists, as it were, want to try and shut down that form of conversation because they deem it to be offensive to them and what they believe in. But you can't go to them, I want to shut down what you are saying because it's offensive to me. So you can't do the reverse. And a normal, sane society, a healthy society, as I have discovered, you should be able to, live freely of whatever you believe in, right? You should be able to walk around, I believe in this, I believe in that. But it just seems to be this small little minority group that has the loudest voice at the moment that is trying to shut everybody up. And the ones that have positions of power to cancel and demonetize all those companies, politicians, they create all those laws surrounding it. It's like they're able to win and you're not. It's crazy to me. It really is.
Yes. And I think part of the reason for that behaviour is that the ideology, the gender identity ideology, is very black and white and divides the world into, on the one hand, the hateful bigots who use the wrong language or who express scepticism about the trans project. And on the other side are the allies, and that sort of military political language is interesting. So it seems to be not possible to be an independent thinker in this area. You're either an ally or you're a bigot.
Yeah, you're a bigot, you're a transphobe, you're a homophobe, you're everything phobe that they deem you to be, which I think is just hilarious, mainly because having a phobia of some kind, and I've said this on my show many times, in order for you to be diagnosed, well, in order to have a phobia, you have to be diagnosed by a psychologist in order to actually say you've got this phobia. There's arachnophobia, there's all these kind of phobias. So these trans activists are coming up with this new phobia that, I mean, who's actually really got it? No one. Let's be honest. Because in order for you to have it, you got to be diagnosed clinically by a psychologist, and it's got to fit a certain criteria for you to be diagnosed with it. So it's amazing to me how they just label you with all these things and they deem it to be so, which I think just goes to show you their lack of, well, let's say smarts or cognitive ability to reason or use any rationale whatsoever. They find it just much easier to throw out a label to somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you take it seriously, the charge of transphobia is a pathologizing of the person who said the wrong thing. And yet, of course, depathologizing is supposed to be one of the key aims of the trans rights project. But I think, it's like the term fascist. I think that most people realise that it's used as a political weapon. It's not really meant to be taken seriously, although some institutions in society have been persuaded to take it seriously. And, there may be people who do genuinely hate trans-identified people. I've not met them. It's conceivable they exist. But if you look at the overheated online conversation, you would think that there's a vast number of people motivated by hatred, and I don't believe there is.
I mean, I haven't seen anyone personally that has spouted hate towards these individuals. Not to say that they don't exist. I'm sure they do. But then it just raises the question of, well, could there be a bot somewhere? Like with the technological world that we are living in at the moment, like how do you know they're actually real and they exist somewhere? That's one of the questions that I have, at least. And it's amazing to me how you got all these activists as well that claim, we've received death threats, we've received a bunch of hate things, but you never actually see any of the receipts. I don't know if you found that, Bernard.
I haven't thought about that. I do think that online culture is something very different from reality. And that's, I think, one of the problems is that there's a disinhibition, especially when people are operating from anonymous accounts, and they will say things that they would never say to someone face to face, or you would hope not. That's apart from the Barry Humphries story, it was online that I started to notice the behaviour of trans activists. I forget how I came across her, but Kathleen Stock, who was at that time a philosophy academic at Sussex University, and I just stumbled across some of the Twitter exchanges involving her, and I was struck by just the absolute toxic and really quite vile attacks on her. And so I naturally thought, well, what has she actually said? And when I looked at what she was saying, she was offering arguments and she wasn't abusing anyone. And it's that kind of disproportion that is everywhere in this topic area.
I don't know if you heard or watched the Dr. Phil episode where a teacher's on there and he's debating trans activists and they're literally verbally attacking him. And he goes, I don't hate anybody. I don't hate you. I don't hate trans people. He goes, one of the best lines I've heard in a while those who hate the truth will always see the truth as hateful. And that's the problem with all these activists, let's call them, that have attached this belief, the trans ideology belief, onto their identity. And because it's a feeling, because it's a mere belief that they've associated with life, everything that somebody says that goes against what they believe, they're obviously going to hate it. And they're going to use violence. They're going to voice their concerns or they voice their opinion in a really aggressive manner. I don't know if you've noticed that, but a lot of them seem to be rather aggressive. Where on the counterbalance, you've got someone like Kathleen Stock, who doesn't get aggressive, who just uses her reason and logic and science to try and have a conversation with these people. But it's amazing to me how much these people actually hate the truth and try and remove it from the very fabric of existence.
Well, one of the accusations that was hurled at me when I first started writing about gender clinics was that I was driving trans kids to suicide.
Oh.
And that's a serious accusation. If it was meant seriously, then those people would have continued raising that concern over time, but they don't. They just drop away. If you continue to do your reporting in what you see as a standard journalistic way, these Twitter trolls, some of them journalists themselves who were attacking me in 2019, they mostly just fade away. And I think some of the temperature in the area is explained by the fact that once you start to ask questions about whether or not these medical interventions are actually going to help or harm these kids, that becomes a big provocation to the activists who have been celebrating these interventions as life-saving and suggesting that this medicalisation is part of a progressive project, even the next civil rights campaign. Because if it is the case that these medical interventions are at least sometimes causing harm, then that's a tremendous condemnation of the self-righteous narrative of the trans rights activists.
Do you believe trans kids exist?
It depends what you mean by that term. Obviously, there are kids who identify as trans. They make that claim. What that means, I think, is going to vary. I do believe there are kids who can be profoundly distressed about a sense of conflict between their body, their biology, and some inner sense of identity, which we call, at least the ideology calls it, gender identity. So I do think that that condition exists, and it can be extremely debilitating, and it does call for a compassionate response. And there are some, transsexual adults who are not ideologues, but who do say that the medical transition, it made them feel less distressed. Often they don't make a really dramatic positive claim. They're not saying that all their problems were solved, but the idea seems to be that there are some people who are less unhappy, less miserable, less distressed after they have medically transitioned. Transition with children, though, is a much more serious issue. And again, I do think that there has been this very small percentage of kids going back some decades who suffer that extreme distress. I mean, the term used to be gender identity disorder. That was seen as too pathologizing. The term mostly still used these days is gender dysphoria. So it's a diagnosis in a psychiatric manual of diagnoses. So I think that the focus on the idea of the trans kid is not really very helpful, because that's essentially an identity politics focus. And I think the focus, well, put it this way, I think the identity politics focus distracts from the issue of this very small group of kids who are suffering real distress. And the question is, what's the best way to help them? So you'll see, posters at trans rights rallies saying, protect trans kids. And the implication is that the way to protect trans kids is to make sure there are no obstacles to these medical interventions, that kids who identify as trans can get rapid access to puberty blockers, to cross-sex hormones, and in some cases surgery when they're still minors. But if the slogan is protect vulnerable kids with gender dysphoria, then there has to be a much more open debate. What are the pros and cons of puberty blockers? What are the pros and cons of social transition whereby adults go along with a kid living out an opposite sex role? What are the pros and cons of cross-sex hormones, of surgery? What's the evidence like? Those are the issues I think that we need to focus on. And so I don't talk too much about trans kids. I talk about, minors who identify as trans, or minors or young people who are diagnosed with gender dysphoria. I'm not saying that the identity politics is totally irrelevant. I can understand why people have pursued this as an identity politics project. It's just that I think that there has to be a properly focused debate involving evidence about helping that very small minority of kids who have gender dysphoria. I mean, it's become more complicated because while if you go back some decades, the kids with this problem were overwhelmingly boys, and the problem typically emerged when they were very young, like preschool age. And when those kids in multiple studies were tracked and followed up over, a number of years, the result was that the vast majority of them, as they grew up through puberty, they grew out of their gender dysphoria. And many of the kids who did grow out of it emerged as young, gay, lesbian, bisexual adults in healthy, non-medicalised bodies. And the problem we have today is that roughly around the period 2010 to 2015, the patients turning up with gender issues a very different group. They're not the early onset males. They are adolescent onset females. And it's unclear how many of them even fulfill the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria. So that's a very complicated issue. And again, I think we need to put the identity politics to one side to some extent and look at these adolescent onset kids, mostly girls, and look at them in a comprehensive way, focusing not just on the gender issue that they've presented, but on their other issues, because in many cases these teenagers have a series of mental health or autism issues. In some cases, the mental health issues and autism predated the gender issues. So the question is, what's really driving the problem, and therefore what is the best response? What's the best therapy or intervention? And I think we just don't get a clear enough focus on these questions in the debate, because the debate is so caught up with a sort of a culture war and identity politics and abuse and people using different language, which they're not able to mutually translate.
Have you heard of BID, body integrity disorder?
No.
So essentially that is the case where somebody doesn't believe that a limb or part of their body belongs to their body.
Yes.
And I found it interesting how these young people especially don't believe that their gender or their biological sex belongs to them. They feel like they were born in the wrong sex. They've changed it now to say gender, and they've included the identity politics surrounding that. And in a world of we're not allowed to discriminate, we're not allowed to be unkind, we're got to be affirming, got to accept them, a lot of it comes down to a mental health disorder that you can't officially diagnose now, because with BID, you can actually diagnose it because that is a legitimate psychological condition. On the outset, you've got someone that doesn't feel comfortable in their own body and they feel like they were born in the wrong body, but we're not allowed to diagnose them anymore with this gender dysphoria. Now it's like you're trans. And for the ones that have actual gender dysphoria, they get like this really, really quick diagnosis, even though it could be autism. It might not be actually legitimate gender dysphoria. So we're getting these rather, because there's so many cases now, there's too many. And all these psychologists and therapists, they're told, you've just got to affirm. If the child says so, it must be so. I mean, like if a child wants to get a tattoo, does that mean that it's allowed? I mean, like, why are we doing these things to kids, especially? Like, why in your research and in your study have you noticed why a lot of these kids are getting caught up with this ideology so much?
Well, it's there are various theories. The feminist view of it is often that teenage girls are getting exposed to quite extreme pornography, sometimes as young as 11 or 12, in which women are brutalized. And according to this theory, these girls are opting out of becoming adult sexual female beings. There's another view that that some of these male teenagers are opting out of becoming men because in society they see so much talk about toxic masculinity, and they don't see inspiring male role models. Then there's the effect of social media, because this sort of troubling flip in the age and sex profile of gender clinic patients, that this happened around the time that the first generation of teenagers who grew up entirely on social media starting to emerge. And I think that there's an element of being disembodied. Now, I mean, this is just speculative, but if you're a kid today, you can spend so much of your time on screens and less time face to face with other humans, or using your body, playing sport, whatever it is, getting out into nature. Instead, you're there on a screen where you can use all sorts of filters. You can change your appearance, you can change your name, you can change your avatar. And so all of that might be giving young people the idea that they can change their sex. I don't know, and I think it's probably going to be a number of different things that are causing this. But the trouble is, because the situation is so politicized, it's difficult to do the research that is necessary. So you may have heard of this concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Yep.
So this was a hypothesis suggested by an American researcher, Lisa Littman, and she based her research on parent groups. And she was very upfront about the fact that she was looking mostly at groups where parents were worried by their teenagers appearing to suddenly declare this gender distress with no childhood history of confusion about their sex. And so Littman's study, it just simply said, this is a preliminary study. She wasn't offering this as a diagnosis. She was simply saying this is a hypothesis. And, the preliminary research with parents suggested that there should be more research. But the reaction to it was absolutely toxic. And there's been an ongoing attempt to shut down any discussion of this possibility. But really, we need more research in this area, not less. I mean, there was a recent paper that was published which shed some more light on this, this possible explanation for what's going on. And that was subject to all sorts of pressure, and the journal crumbled and retracted the paper. Just extraordinary. And the objections were clearly bad faith objections, supposed ethical concerns. But in reality, when you look at it closely, those concerns could be applied to so much other research that no one is troubled by, because the results of this other research reinforce the trans narrative, as opposed to suggest a conclusion that could be a problem for the trans narrative. But, to come back to your question, what is driving this incredible explosion in the numbers of young people declaring a trans or a non-binary identity and wanting to medicalize their bodies? I think you have to look at all sorts of different causes. The availability of this new medical model is probably part of it. If you create this possibility of putting puberty on hold, which is a relatively new thing for anyone to suggest. And, because cross-sex hormones have been around for a while, but this use of hormone suppression to stop a naturally timed puberty really only goes back to late 1990s, early 2000s, and that's recent. And I guess, as many people have pointed out, that puberty can be a difficult time, especially for girls, with the start of menstruation. And if their puberty starts early and they mature earlier than other girls, they will come in for a lot of unwanted male attention. So it becomes very tempting, this possibility of hitting the pause button on puberty, and it was promoted in that way, as if it's a simple pause button, with no risks, totally reversible, we were told. And as the years have passed and there's more and more puberty blocking going on, it's become clear that this is not a simple intervention. Its reversibility is questionable. On the data that we have, it looks like this is putting kids on a one-way path of lifelong medicalisation, and they're starting as young as 10 on puberty blockers, and the available studies, the vast majority of kids who start on puberty blockers will go on to cross-sex hormones, and the cross-sex hormones are supposed to be taken for life. So it really doesn't look like a low stakes, no regrets, reversible option.
Because you can't stop puberty.
It's interesting to me. I mean, that when you see discussions about this, I'm told that the science of puberty is still not very well understood, how it's initiated. And it seems to be clear that, in animal studies, that if you suppress the natural sex hormones, that seems to have some effects on cognition. But in the human sphere, this seems to be an unknown. Whether or not there's a sort of a crucial window of development during which you have to be exposed to the natural sex hormones, and if you're not, you may miss out on some crucial cognitive, psychological, identity development. And initially, when puberty blockers were being heavily promoted, around, say, I suppose, the period from around, 2010 through to about 2018, 2019, I think that's roughly the period when the promotion of puberty blockers was very superficial. And then around 2019, 2020, there started to be expressed more doubt and more concern about them. So, for example, Britain's National Health Service, which had a web page on gender treatment and used to claim that puberty blockers were fully reversible, in 2020, without any announcement, they did a stealth edit on that page and introduced much more uncertainty, including uncertainty in relation to the effects of puberty blocking on psychological development. So it's certainly it's a profound intervention. That's the impression I get from listening to scientists and clinicians who appear to me to be more thoughtful about it, and they make the point that it is it's a very, very serious intervention, and the full effects of it are unknown. And it certainly seems unwise to assume that it's going to be reversible.
What we do know is if a child doesn't go through puberty, if they've blocked it or stopped it from occurring, we know that during the stages of puberty, having released the proper chemical hormones that your body naturally produces for that particular sex, they are able to grow and develop, which is a healthy and natural process. Sure, for some women and even some men, it may be a horrible time because, you know, you get acne, you get all kinds of things. It's just you're developing. You're going from a young boy or a young girl into a young man or a young woman. And that period of time, you need to have the unleashing of your body's natural adult chemicals in order for your gonads to grow, to drop. If you don't allow that process to go on, what we do know is that if someone does stop their puberty, if they're a male biologically, then their testicles don't drop, their penis doesn't grow, nothing. They still got the biological structure of a boy, even though they've got the age of, say, an adult or a teenager, or they're supposed to have, that is. That's why they've got to go on, well, we've got to have these interventions of hormones as well, like testosterone, estrogen, all these other chemicals, but they're synthetic. They're making it worse. And for a man, they're not even supposed to have a huge amount of estrogen in their system. They're meant to have the primary of testosterone, which is created in the testes. And if they haven't had those testicles drop or develop or grow, I mean, there should be science, but a lot of people go, no, if someone believes that they're born in the wrong body, then the best thing to do is, you know what? We're going to chemically castrate them. They're never able to receive any sexual pleasure, no arousal whatsoever, no ejaculation whatsoever. The female eggs, they don't drop because they haven't been through menstruation, none of it. And we've got these people that are going, this is what the child wants. This is what the child has consented to, because they have told us that they believe they're born in the wrong sex. So we're going to put them on these blockers and these cross-sex hormones. It's butchery. It's mutilation. But they've created this lovely, fancy little narrative saying that it's reversible. And I actually did a video on that very thing, in how some journals and medical places that talk about gender care and all that sort of stuff, they have changed the wording silently. They won't tell you. When you do a comparison, it's all changed. And it's just amazing to me. Like, they won't admit it. They won't.
No, well, what's going to happen with these kids is very hard to say. There's so many unknowns, though it does seem clear that, you know, the current advice from those promoting gender transition is to start kids on puberty blockers quite early in puberty. So if a kid is started on puberty blockers early in puberty, and then, as is suggested by the existing data, they go on to cross-sex hormones, then it seems that infertility, sterilisation, is the result. And with males, it seems that they may never be capable of sexual orgasm. The effect of this on females, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't see it discussed much. But let's say you have a female started on puberty blockers early in puberty, goes on to cross-sex hormones. What is the capacity for sexual intimacy like? like, for that person. I don't know. It doesn't seem to be discussed much, but yes, it's a very troubling area. It's just, and you may have seen that there was an activist, I think, in the US who suggested that all children should be put on puberty blockers till it became clear which kids were trans. And in that sort of similar vein of thinking, the term "the wrong puberty" is being used.
Yeah.
And the other sort of rhetorical trick is that when activists hear warnings about irreversible medical interventions, they will refer to the wrong puberty as irreversible, as if it's an optional intervention. So puberty becomes a kind of a disease or an illness, at least in some cases, that has to be treated.
Which is a sad thing when you really think about it. Like the amount that the language is changing and the amount of people that are just going along with it and saying, oh, you must be right. You must be totally right that people are going through the wrong puberty. I mean, nobody goes through the wrong puberty. You go through the right puberty. It's founded in, even at conception, that's when everything is formed in your DNA and your genetic code for you to be either a male or a female. And for some cases, you've got intersex people, which is still male or female, believe it or not. Just everyone's going, it's all about this identity construct they've created, and we're going to remove biology. You can't talk about that. You can't talk about what we're doing to kids with the puberty suppression. Can't talk about kids, what we're doing to them with the cross-sex hormones, or God forbid, the surgery intervention. You can't talk about any of that because that is apparently harmful and hateful to the person, and that child is going to be at risk now of them trying to commit suicide because of what you've said, even though it is the truth, even though it is scientific, and even though you've got evidence and data to back up everything that you're saying, this is harmful and damaging to a kid. No, apparently you're the bad person because that's all that information is going to be harmful to that kid. So now you're somehow liable, which I think is just absurd. But you're totally right in the fact that we don't know too much about what happens with women or with young girls because it's not really discussed or looked too much into. But we're making eunuchs out of young boys and we're sterilizing the next generation is what we're doing. And no one really, those that do, bat an eyelid to it, and then they warn, they're silenced. But what are we doing, honestly?
Yeah, I think a big part of the problem is that the media has failed to properly investigate, scrutinise and report in this area. And the failure has been partly passive, as in simply not reporting issues such as the risk to fertility, the risk to sexual function. And the other aspect of the failure has been active in the sense of journalists behaving like trans activist allies and pumping out superficial, emotive, identity politics stories about these medical interventions and not asking the normal questions that you would ask if you're reporting on other medical interventions. What's the evidence? What are the risks? Where's the data?
Why wouldn't you classify yourself as being sort of like this ally? I mean, you are a journalist. You've worked in the media sector for a long time. Why wouldn't you classify yourself as being an ally to the transgender people?
Well, I think it's partly generational. I'm Gen X, and I think that younger journalists have emerged, from their university education with
indoctrination.
Well, I guess you could call it that. I mean, it's just that ideas that seem unlikely to me, or ideas that seem ideological to them, are just part of the sort of the factual background that they take for granted. I think probably another reason is the left-right political divide. And it just so happens that identity politics of this kind is supposed to be left-wing, supposed to be progressive. And my background it goes right back to my university days, really, when I fell out of love with what was considered to be left-wing, a left-wing way of looking at the world. And so it's probably not surprising that I ended up working for the Australian newspaper, which, its ideological nature, you'd say, is centre-right. And it's just easier for a journalist on a centre-right newspaper to write critically about a subject that is deemed to be left-wing. So, I mean, in a sense, people, ABC journalists have my sympathy, because let's say you've got an ABC journalist who really wants to do a thorough, proper, investigative job on gender clinics. Well, that ABC journalist is going to face a whole lot of hurdles, which I didn't face at the Australian. So that's part of it. Yeah, I mean, but I should say that a lot of the best informed critics of gender medicine are on the left.
Really?
And yeah. And leftist feminists are, a very significant group among the critics, informed critics of gender medicine. And there are some figures on the right who declare themselves to be, critics or skeptics of gender medicine, but who really don't seem to know very much about it at all. It cuts both ways, there's exceptions on both sides. But I found this experience going through this very strange area, which is not quite medicine, not quite politics. It has made me, I think, less ideologically consistent. So I'm not troubled so much these days by wanting to have some overall political philosophy, because I see how political philosophy, and this urge for people to attack the right enemies and defend the right allies, that whole mentality has made it much more difficult to look clearly at what gender medicine is and to ask the right questions. Ideally you would take gender medicine out of the political category entirely. And I think this is one of the problems, because people who, for whatever reason, have got to know something about what's happening in gender clinics, they'll often turn to each other in consternation and say, well, why can't other people see it? Why can't people see that this is something that really needs to be thoroughly investigated? There needs to be an inquiry. And the answer is that because of political philosophies, a lot of people can't see it as it is. So they see uplifting, inspiring stories of stunning and brave trans children and the heroic doctors who are helping these kids to be the trans kids they always were. And, and that's a progressive story. It's, we had gay liberation in the 80s, and this is the next thing.
Yeah.
And so when you think of it that way, you don't descend into the detail with, an open mind, and you manage to not notice that these kids are being sterilised. You manage not to notice that probably a good number of them, if they were left alone, would emerge as healthy gay, lesbian, bisexual young adults. And we've got this extraordinary situation. I mean that likelihood it's still speculative, because what was happening with those little boys mostly, that may be a very different condition to what we're seeing now. The early onset males versus the adolescent onset females, they don't necessarily have the same outcomes. And this is a point made by Dr. Ken Zucker, who is probably the leading or one of the leading international experts on youth gender dysphoria. So he draws this distinction between the kids who are seen for the first time early on and the kids who are seen for the first time at adolescence. And he thinks that the latter group, the adolescent onset people, are less likely to grow out of it. And I guess that shouldn't be too surprising, because, they're seen for the first time when they're adolescents. I'm still trying to think this through myself, but, in some cases they will be seen for the first time with their adolescence. Presumably, the question is, I guess, whether or not the gender distress goes back in time, but it just wasn't seen at the time, or whether or not the gender distress is this thing that's come out of the blue and might be rapid onset gender dysphoria, assuming that ever becomes a diagnosis.
I know Zucker was cancelled by a lot of people for doing that particular study. And going back to your point about people that are, it's kind of a mixed bag, I've noticed, because you've got some people on the left that would be considered to be progressive, let's say. They're actually very much against this gender ideology. I've spoken with first wave and even second wave feminists that are very much against this because of the whole issues that surrounding female rights and same-sex spaces and all that sort of stuff. So that you've got these trans women going into female-only spaces, which amazes me how they've got to, in order to classify themselves as being a woman, they've got to put trans in front of it. Like, I've always laughed at that and gone, well, why have you got to put trans in front of it if you're claiming to be a real woman? Shouldn't you just have woman? It's like they say, I hate this term, cis. You're a cis man, you're a cis woman. It just gives me anyway. It frustrates me using that terminology, but they'll use it. Why? Like, just call people for what they really are, man, woman. But it goes down to the whole, I get it, gender identity narrative once again. But then you've got the third wave feminists that are all in favor primarily of the gender narrative because they deem it to be rather progressive, and you've got to be affirming, you've got to empower every single people. And you've got these ones that go, if they claim to be a trans woman, they are real women. Those third wave feminists because they're really angry people. I don't know if you've noticed that, but a lot of them are really, really angry with the world and themselves. And it's sad. It really is sad to see that. And then you've got I've noticed some people on the right that say we need to be kinder, that we need to be a bit more lenient to these people, that we shouldn't talk about it. We'll just let them be, let them go and do their own thing. And I'm like, hang on a minute. No. See, I used to have that kind of philosophy a couple of years ago. I didn't speak up about it. I started noticing it. I was I don't know too much about this, so I can't really talk about it too much. I let it go. I'm like, other people will speak up for me. And then it got to the point of absolute insanity, Bernard, that I was like, no, I know what's right and I know what's wrong. This ain't right. It's taking over society, our culture as we know it, for the sake of women, for the sake of kids. I'm going to do the right thing and speak up about it. It was after a conversation that I had with Helen Joyce, who wrote Trans When Ideology Meets Reality. She helped me really understand this a bit more. I started listening to Jordan Peterson a little bit more, started listening to people that were in the know about this entire issue. And maybe I'm going on a little bit of a rant here, but just sort of my little backstory for you.
Yep.
But then I just was like, I need to start saying things. And hopefully my voice will be captured in such a way that people will be able to resonate with a young person that is talking about it. Doesn't matter whether or not he's conservative or not. It should just come down to common sense, should come down to science. This is what we know to be biology. Biology is real. It's fact. Stop going away from it. Let's try and I don't even think you can have a debate anymore about it. But anyway, let's just try and find this way to end all this madness before it gets incredibly worse. That's my thought on the whole thing. I don't know if there was a question there. Sorry about that. I went on a little bit of a rant.
It's true that there are some people on the right who have helped push the gender ideology narrative. I think it was Theresa May in the UK who had promised something that looked like self-ID gender, whereby you could change gender without a medical diagnosis, be a simple speech act. And I've noticed in Australia that some of the moderate liberals seem to be quite uncritical and unreflective about what's going on. And I've wondered about that, and I thought, could it be because conservatives are always being abused and smeared? Yeah. And the moderate liberals, what sets them apart is that they are considered to be more tolerant, more kind, more open-minded. But I guess it's easy to mistake that sort of open-mindedness for being uncritical and basking in the sort of reflected glow of being a trans ally. But I do get the impression, this is based on listening to parliamentary debates, I do get the impression that these moderate liberals haven't really looked at the issue in any kind of detail. That also goes for all of the, not all, but many of the Labor and Greens people who have been, giving speeches when the state parliaments were passing laws against so-called conversion therapy, or when the parliaments were passing laws to enable self-declared gender identity. And I listened to many hours of speeches in the Queensland, the ACT and the Victorian parliaments, and it seemed clear to me that many of the Labor people standing up there and the Greens and others supporting these bills really had very little understanding of the issues. And the media is partly to blame for that, because if the ABC had been an honest broker in this area, the outlook would have changed profoundly, I think. You probably wouldn't have been able to get those bills through Parliament.
I think the whole conversion therapy bill radically changed everything, because now therapists aren't allowed to do their job properly. And now you've given the ones that would be considered more progressive and liberal and going down this ideological pathway, you're giving them free rein to affirm a child that says and comes to them, hey, I feel like I'm not in the right body. And the therapist will just go, oh, sure, by all means. It's like, no, you're a child. You don't fully understand this. You probably won't fully understand it until your frontal lobe develops at the age of 25, 26. And even then it's debatable. But, okay, society says 18. That is the age where you're able to consent to this stuff. But as kids, they go to a therapist goes to them, all right, the logical solution here is you believe you are a trans kid. I believe you. Must be so. So I'm going to put you on these cross-sex hormones, and we're going to recommend you to an endocrinologist. And they'll give you all the things that you actually need. And it's just one person in after the next. Just like becomes this chain cycle. And it goes back to the so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria. I mean, how do you even quantify that, or even consider that to be even a diagnosis of sorts? Rapid, like the fact that it's so quick and it's happening to so many other kids all at once, as it would seem. It's like when a friend goes, I've got gender dysphoria, I think I'm trans. Then the other person goes, I think I'm trans too. I think I've got gender dysphoria too. It's like social contagion, as it were.
I guess so, but I guess you could take the view that it's still gender dysphoria. It may still involve real distress. It's just a question of the pathway that takes you there. So the pathway involves, peer and online influence, but the distress is still real and requires some response. It's unclear.
How are you feeling about your work currently? Have you faced a great deal of backlash with your writings?
Most I did initially in 2019. But then, as I say, I mean, I just kept on reporting because, anyone who looked at the material could see that it wasn't inflammatory. It wasn't, it was relatively straight reporting. And yet, if it was really so harmful and damaging, why did the various online trolls and others mostly go away? They haven't completely gone. They sort of pop up every now and then, but they rarely have anything of substance to say. I had a large, as in a complaint for the Press Council, which involved many articles, and that was partially upheld. And I think the Press Council remains a problem. I think it's difficult to do normal journalism in this area, and it's difficult to do normal journalism even at a centre-right newspaper like The Australian. And part of the problem is that, especially back then, it's difficult for editors to work out what is reasonable in reporting, because the stuff that I was doing it looks completely different from the reporting that was being done on gender clinics in the Age newspaper in Melbourne or the ABC. So if you're an editor and there's one particular journalist who is an outlier, it makes you nervous, and that's understandable. The Press Council, I think, probably with good intentions, drew up a reporting guideline for, it was LGBTQ, etc. But the key element of it was to do with trans reporting. And when I found out about that guideline in 2019, it struck me that was going to make it more difficult for normal journalistic scrutiny of gender clinics, and that turned out to be the case. But I see now there's a bit more reporting. There's a couple of people on my old newspaper who are following the gender clinic story, which is great. The Daily Mail does some reporting on it. The Daily Telegraph does as well. So it's not such a lonely task.
Mm.
Or, there's better reporting in the US too.
There's the Spectator spiked, I think. I've noticed Unheard.
Yeah.
Do Kathleen Stock. There's Douglas Murray. I love his reporting on things. Very intelligent man, Douglas.
Mm.
Even though he's a gay man, doesn't associate himself with the LGBT, whatever, Rainbow Alphabet Mafia mob.
Mm.
It's a very intellectual human, I think. The way he comes about certain topics, I've really, really appreciated his dialogue on many issues. And the one thing we disagree with, surprisingly, is on atheism and religion. Surprisingly, that's pretty much it. And possibly homosexuality, but that's about it, really. But there's other people that I've enjoyed. Jordan Peterson, Helen Joyce. I've even spoken to a couple of transsexuals. There's Buck Angel. There's the offensive trainee, Marcus Dibb. There's quite a few in this space that they're all against this ideological madness, and they've gone what used to be considered as, well, we can just live our lives the way we want to live it in the shadows. We're not seeking attention whatsoever. They've gone, it has changed too much, where all these activists are seeking attention so much, and it's just ruined transgenderism as we know it, or ruined what it used to be, essentially, which I think is really sad. Final question for you, Bernard. What are your thoughts on the whole pronoun rubbish?
I'm not fussed at a personal level to using someone's the name they would wish me to use. It hasn't happened yet that someone's asked me to use pronouns, and it puzzles me a bit because they're third-person pronouns. It's not a huge deal for me if it's decided at an interpersonal level where it might just be a matter of courtesy. I certainly don't agree with the power of the state being used to mandate this.
Yep.
I'm not too fussed about the issue, really. To me, the really important issue is the medicalisation of vulnerable kids.
Yep. I'm with you on that. How can we support you further?
Oh, well, it's great if people subscribe to my newsletter. I decided at the outset that I would put all of the articles outside the paywall. because I want them to be freely available so that people can share them. That's it, really, I suppose. Subscribe and share the articles that, if you think they're worth sharing.
Where can they follow you? Is it just Gender Clinics?
They just search for my name, Bernard Lane, Gender Clinic News. It will come up. It's the URL is genderclinicnews, one word, .com.
I'll make sure that it's in the show notes and I'll share it. I'm sure my audience, considering they're very well versed on the subject themselves, I'm sure they'll find you, and hopefully they can support your amazing work. But thank you so much for your time, Bernard. I've really enjoyed this conversation. So appreciate you joining me today on the Storybox podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jay.